My mother-in-law moved into my nursery while I was in labor at hospital. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I was still bleeding from childbirth when I opened my baby's door and found my mother-in-law sleeping in his room. I stood in the hallway of the home my husband Mark and I had purchased just a year ago, clutching my newborn son tightly to my chest. My body was completely broken, trembling from sheer physical exhaustion after a grueling delivery. I just wanted to place my baby in the beautiful, custom-built crib I had spent 6 months painstakingly restoring by hand. I had sanded the wood, painted it a soft sage green, and meticulously arranged the entire nursery to be our peaceful sanctuary. It was supposed to be a safe haven for my first child. Instead, I stared in absolute horror at the nightmare unfolding in front of my eyes. The crib was completely gone. In its place sat a massive, heavy oak queen-sized bed, covered in a garish floral quilt that smelled overwhelmingly of cheap, overpowering lavender perfume. The soft, whimsical woodland wallpaper I had carefully hung was completely obscured by towering, dark wooden wardrobes and heavy dressers. The plush rocking chair where I had planned to nurse my son in the quiet hours of the night had been shoved unceremoniously into the hallway, scratching the hardwood floors. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the sheer, incomprehensible reality of the situation washed over me. This wasn't a temporary visit or a simple misunderstanding. This was a hostile, calculated takeover of my home, executed while I was at my absolute most vulnerable. I am Chloe, a 28-year-old first-time mother who simply wanted to give her baby a perfect start in life. I had meticulously planned every single detail of his arrival, trying to control the uncontrollable variables of motherhood. But as I stood there, utterly paralyzed by the sight of Brenda's thick orthopedic shoes lined up perfectly under the windowsill where my baby's toy chest used to be, I realized I had completely missed the biggest threat to my family. How do you look at your husband after he sells your sanctuary? The answer, I would soon discover, was that you don't look at him at all. You just start planning your escape. I took a shaky breath, stepping backward into the hallway just as a loud, exaggerated snore erupted from the massive oak bed. The true nightmare of my homecoming was only just beginning to unfold around me. To understand the sheer magnitude of this betrayal, you have to understand the suffocating dynamic between my husband Mark and his mother Brenda. During my entire pregnancy, Brenda treated my growing body like it was community property. She would show up unannounced at our house, her hands immediately grabbing at my stomach without asking permission. When I gently told her I needed space, Mark would just sigh heavily and rub his temples. "She's just excited to be a grandmother, Chloe. She means well. Please don't make a big deal out of nothing," he would whine, completely dismissing my discomfort. It was a pattern that defined our entire marriage. Mark choosing the path of least resistance, which always meant catering to his mother's endless emotional demands. Brenda was a master manipulator who played the delicate victim whenever she was challenged. If I set a basic boundary, like asking her not to buy aggressive, gender-stereotyped toys, she would burst into loud, theatrical tears and claim I was trying to cut her out of the baby's life. Mark would inevitably rush to comfort her, leaving me standing there feeling like the villain in my own home. The most glaring red flag came during my 3rd trimester. I had explicitly chosen a modern, minimalist crib that met all current safety standards. Brenda hated it. Back in my day, we used sturdy drop-side cribs, and Mark survived just fine. She scoffed during a tense Sunday dinner. The very next day, a massive, outdated, and heavily recalled drop-side crib was delivered to our front porch. I flat out refused to put it in the house. Mark practically begged me to just set it up in the corner to keep the peace. I stood my ground, sent it back, and bought the one I wanted. That was the moment Brenda realized I couldn't be easily controlled, and I am certain that was the exact moment she began plotting to establish total dominance over my home. She knew she couldn't break my rules from the outside. So, she decided the only way to win was to completely infiltrate my defenses. I had no idea my husband was actually helping her build the Trojan horse. My water broke violently at 2 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. I woke up gasping, a sudden rush of fluid soaking the mattress. Panic and pure adrenaline surged through my veins as I violently shook Mark awake. The drive to the hospital was a blur of intense, radiating back pain and blinding streetlights. I was terrified but focused solely on bringing my son safely into the world. I anticipated a grueling physical ordeal, but I entirely expected my husband to be my solid anchor. Instead, the delivery room became a masterclass in profound abandonment. My labor dragged on for an agonizing 30 hours. The contractions felt like heavy iron bands crushing my spine. While I was actively crying through the peaks of the pain, gripping the plastic bed rails until my knuckles turned stark white, Mark was perpetually distracted. He kept pacing the small room, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his phone. Every time a nurse came in to check my dilation, he would abruptly slip out into the hallway. "Just grabbing another long coffee, babe," he would mutter dismissively, barely making eye contact. "Got some urgent work emails to handle." It felt incredibly wrong. He wasn't holding my hand, and he certainly wasn't focused on the birth of our child. At hour 25, the doctor recommended an epidural because my body was physically giving out from exhaustion. I begged Mark to stay close while the anesthesiologist inserted the needle into my spine. He promised he would, but right as the procedure began, his phone aggressively buzzed. He looked at the screen, his face draining of color, and immediately stepped out of the room yet again. I was left entirely alone, shivering violently on the sterile bed, leaning on a compassionate nurse I had just met. I forced myself to compartmentalize the deep, aching hurt. I channeled every ounce of my remaining energy into pushing, focusing entirely on my baby. Finally, my son was born. He was placed on my chest, warm and crying, and for a fleeting moment, nothing else mattered. I thought the worst part of my journey was finally over. I was about to discover how devastatingly wrong I truly was about everything. The drive home from the hospital felt surreal. I was wrapped in thick sweatpants, sitting gingerly on a medical donut cushion, holding my tiny son securely in his rear-facing car seat. Every bump in the road sent a sharp jolt of pain through my healing stitches. I was functioning on maybe 4 hours of broken sleep spread over 3 agonizing days. All I craved was the quiet sanctuary of our home, a hot shower, and the gentle, calming atmosphere of the carefully curated nursery. Mark was unnervingly silent the entire drive, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he didn't immediately turn off the engine. He hesitated, nervously clearing his throat. "Chloe, just so you know, my mom is here to help out for a bit," he mumbled, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I was too exhausted to argue. I figured she had come over to drop off an unwanted casserole or aggressively offer unsolicited breastfeeding advice. I assumed it would be a brief, annoying visit. I carefully carried the heavy car seat up the front steps, desperate to lay my son down in his beautiful crib. I walked through the front door, kicked off my shoes, and slowly made my way up the carpeted staircase, wincing with every single step. The house was oddly quiet. I reached the landing and turned toward the nursery at the end of the hall. That is when my weary brain short-circuited. My custom-painted crib, the one I had poured all my nesting energy into, was sitting awkwardly in the narrow hallway, shoved against the wall like discarded garbage. The beautiful mobile I had crafted by hand was hopelessly tangled in the slats. I felt a heavy stone drop in my stomach. I pushed open the nursery door, holding my sleeping baby against my chest, and stepped into a completely foreign room. The smell of cheap lavender perfume hit me like a physical punch. Massive, heavy oak furniture completely dominated the small space. It wasn't just a guest cot. It was Brenda's entire master bedroom suite, completely erasing every trace of my baby's sanctuary. I stood paralyzed, unable to fully process the sheer violation of my personal space. The door clicked shut softly behind me, trapping me inside the waking nightmare. Surprise! Brenda's shrill voice echoed from the doorway, making me flinch instinctively. She was wearing a velour tracksuit, holding a mug of my expensive coffee, beaming with a sickeningly triumphant smile. I moved in to help the new mama. "You are going to be so incredibly exhausted, Chloe." I told Mark it simply made no sense for me to be across town when my precious grandbaby needs me right here. I turned to look at Mark, who was cowering behind her, nervously rubbing the back of his neck. My voice was a hoarse, trembling whisper. "Mark, what is this? Where's my son's room?" Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the floor, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Look, babe, it's temporary." Mom had some sudden issues with her apartment lease, and she needs a place to stay. It made perfect sense to combine her moving in with helping us with the baby. She means well. The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was suffocating. Sudden apartment issues? She had a massive queen-sized bed, heavy dressers, and a towering wardrobe meticulously arranged in a 10 by 10 room. You do not accomplish that kind of heavy lifting on a temporary whim. This required professional movers and hours of coordinated effort. I looked down at my sleeping newborn, feeling the thick hospital pads shifting between my legs. My body was screaming in raw pain. I was bleeding, shattered, and operating on zero sleep. I didn't have the strength to yell. I didn't have the physical ability to drag her dressers out onto the lawn. I was a hostage in my own home, completely betrayed by the man who vowed to protect me. Brenda stepped forward, reaching out to take the baby. Let Grandma take him while you rest on the couch. You look absolutely dreadful, dear. I recoiled violently, clutching my son tighter against my chest, feeling a primal surge of maternal rage burning through my exhaustion. I refused to let her touch him, turning my back on them to retreat to the master bedroom. I knew I had to survive the night before I could formulate a plan. The first week of my postpartum recovery was an absolute, unmitigated hell. My own home had been entirely hijacked, transformed into Brenda's personal retirement villa. She aggressively completely took over the kitchen, replacing all of my carefully prepped postpartum freezer meals with her heavy, sodium-packed casseroles. She would sit in the living room all day with the television blaring, barking orders at Mark to bring her endless cups of tea. But the absolute worst part was her relentless, suffocating interference with my son. Every single time he made a tiny whimper, Brenda would sprint into my bedroom, completely ignoring the concept of knocking, and attempt to snatch him directly from my arms. You're holding him entirely wrong, Chloe. You're going to give him gas, she would aggressively critique, hovering over me like a vulture while I desperately tried to establish a painful breastfeeding latch. If I asked for basic privacy, she would dramatically clutch her chest and loudly complain to Mark that I was deliberately alienating her from her only grandchild. Mark, acting like a spineless coward, would constantly plead with me to just let her do things her way to keep the peace in the house. I was isolated, physically recovering from major trauma, and trapped in a toxic psychological warfare zone. I spent most of my days locked in the master bedroom, holding my baby tight, listening to Brenda rearrange my living room furniture downstairs. The custom crib sat abandoned in the hallway, a constant, painful physical reminder of my husband's monumental betrayal. I refused to let Brenda take over the night shifts, despite her constant, forceful insistence that I needed to rest. I didn't trust her alone with my child for a single second. My maternal instincts were screaming at a deafening volume, warning me that her presence wasn't just overbearing, it was highly calculated. She wasn't here to help me heal, she was actively trying to replace me. The exhaustion was slowly breaking my mind, but the fierce need to protect my baby kept me completely lucid. I started paying close attention to every detail, quietly watching the mail and listening to their hushed conversations. The first undeniable crack in their elaborate story appeared in a stack of incoming mail. The glaring inconsistency presented itself on a dreary Thursday afternoon. I had shuffled out to the mailbox while Brenda was loudly snoring on the couch, taking her mandatory afternoon nap. I was sorting through the usual junk mail when I stopped dead in my tracks. Right in the middle of the stack was an official envelope from the Department of Motor Vehicles, explicitly addressed to Brenda. But the shocking part wasn't just the sender, it was the address. It had my home address printed flawlessly on the official label. You do not rapidly update your permanent legal address with the government for a sudden, temporary apartment issue. Changing your DMV records is a deliberate, calculated step for a permanent, long-term relocation. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I walked back inside and quietly inspected the hallway outside the desecrated nursery. I noticed the sheer volume of her belongings for the first time. She didn't just bring clothes and furniture. She had brought her heavy winter coats, her massive collection of porcelain figurines, and boxes of decades-old tax documents. She hadn't packed a suitcase. She had literally packed her entire life. This wasn't an emergency stay. This was a hostile, permanent occupation. Mark had completely lied to my face, looking me directly in the eye while my body was still recovering from birth. The sense of betrayal was so deep it felt physically sickening. How long had they been planning this? How much of my sanctuary had they negotiated away behind my back? I knew asking Mark would only result in more pathetic, cowardly gaslighting. He would stumble over his words and make endless excuses for his mother. I needed hard, undeniable proof, the kind of concrete evidence that could hold up in a brutal legal confrontation. I retreated to the master bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me. I looked at my sleeping son, his tiny chest rising and falling softly. I promised him right then that nobody was taking his home. I set an alarm for 3 in the morning, knowing exactly where I needed to look to find the damning truth. I waited in the dark, my heart pounding, ready to unlock my husband's deepest secrets. At exactly 3 a.m., the house was completely silent, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy snores echoing from Brenda in the nursery. I sat up in bed, ignoring the sharp twinge in my pelvis. Mark was dead asleep beside me, his back turned, blissfully ignorant of the storm brewing inches away. I gently picked up my son, letting him nurse quietly in the dark to keep him settled, and slowly reached over to Mark's bedside table. My fingers wrapped around his sleek silver iPad. He thought he was incredibly clever by changing his phone passcode 2 weeks before my due date, claiming it was a new corporate security policy. But Mark was fundamentally lazy. He never bothered to update the passcode on his tablet, which synced directly to his primary iCloud account. I typed in his old code, our anniversary date, ironically, and the screen illuminated with a soft, bright glow. I immediately bypassed his generic apps and opened his main email client. My hands were visibly shaking as I tapped the search bar. I typed in Brenda's name, sorting by the oldest messages first. At first, it was just mundane family updates. But then, I noticed a strangely labeled folder buried deep in the archives. Property transition. My breath hitched in my throat as I tapped it open. The folder was packed with dozens of deeply incriminating emails, dating back a full 5 months. I opened the very first message in the chain. It was an official email from Brenda's previous landlord, confirming the receipt of her formal notice to permanently vacate the premises. The sender address belonged to Mark. My husband had actively negotiated the termination of his mother's lease while I was heavily pregnant, carefully picking out paint swatches for a nursery he fully intended to destroy. He had orchestrated the entire timeline. The devastating truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Brenda's lease wasn't lost or suddenly compromised. Mark had deliberately canceled it to forcefully move her into my home without my consent. The sheer depth of his deceit was worse than anything I could have ever imagined. I sat frozen in the dark bedroom, my baby sleeping against my chest, as I feverishly scrolled through the horrifying property transition folder. Every single email was a calculated stab in the back. I found the digital receipts for the professional moving company. The timestamp on the paid invoice was absolutely sickening. Mark had officially authorized the massive credit card payment for the movers at exactly 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. I checked my own hospital records mentally. That was the exact hour I was actively pushing our son out, screaming in agony while Mark was supposedly grabbing a long coffee in the hallway. He wasn't working or nervously pacing. He was actively coordinating the destruction of my sanctuary. I switched over to his synced iMessage history, pulling up the direct text thread between Mark and Brenda. The messages were a masterclass in toxic manipulation and utter disrespect. "Don't worry, Mom. She'll be too exhausted to fight back once the baby is here," Mark had texted her weeks before my due date. "Just get the furniture in while we are at the hospital. I'll handle Chloe." Brenda's replies were even more chilling. "I'll take over the night shifts permanently as soon as we are settled," she wrote. "Chloe can go back to work early and focus on her career. The baby needs an experienced hand, and you know she's too fragile to handle this alone." They weren't just plotting a real estate takeover. They were actively conspiring to push me out of my role as a mother. Brenda wanted a do-over baby, and my spineless husband was serving my child up to her on a silver platter. They viewed me as nothing more than an incubator and a paycheck to fund their twisted lifestyle. I took meticulous screenshots of every single receipt, email, and damning text message. I wasn't just crying anymore. The tears had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. They thought I was incredibly weak, but they had violently awakened a very dangerous bear. As the sun began to rise, painting the bedroom walls in a soft, mocking pink glow, my grand strategy rapidly clicked into place. I quietly emailed the entire folder of highly incriminating screenshots to my personal, secure email address. Then, I forwarded everything directly to Jess. Jess is my blunt, fiercely loyal, no-nonsense best friend who works as a paralegal at a ruthless family law firm downtown. She is the kind of friend who would cheerfully help you hide a body, no questions asked. Within 3 minutes, my phone vibrated in my hand. Jess was already awake and absolutely furious. Her text simply read, "I am bringing fire and brimstone. Do not say a single word to them. Call me when the parasites are gone." I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile in the quiet darkness of the room. We spent the next hour texting back and forth, meticulously outlining an ironclad legal and logistical response. Jess promised to fast-track a consultation with her firm's top attorney to review my options regarding the house, which was entirely in my name because Mark's credit score was a complete disaster before we married. To successfully execute this massive counterstrike, I needed a few critical days to heal physically and finalize the rapid response logistics. I had to become an Academy Award-winning actress. For the next 3 days, I completely swallowed my burning pride. I played the exhausted, submissive, overwhelmed new wife perfectly. I let Brenda loudly criticize my folding techniques, and I thanked her with a sweet, tight smile. I let Mark pat me on the head condescendingly while he praised his mother for saving our sanity. Every time Brenda casually rearranged my kitchen cabinets or made passive-aggressive comments about my breast milk supply, I just nodded and retreated upstairs. I let them believe their hostile takeover was a complete and total success. I let them drop their guard entirely, acting as the perfect, defeated victim while I secretly sharpened the guillotine blade right behind their arrogant backs. I just needed one perfect opportunity to strike, and Brenda was about to deliver it. The perfect opportunity materialized on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after my grueling delivery. I was finally feeling physically stronger, the bleeding had significantly slowed, and the intense fog of sheer exhaustion was lifting. I was in the kitchen fixing a quick lunch when I heard my baby crying upstairs. Usually, I would sprint up the steps, but I was waiting for a bottle warmer to finish. I hurried up a minute later, walking softly on the carpeted hallway. As I approached my bedroom, I saw Brenda standing over my bed. She was holding my precious, 2-week-old son in one arm, and in her other hand, she held a plastic bottle filled with plain water. She was actively trying to force the nipple into his tiny mouth. "There you go, just a little water to settle that tummy. Your mother's milk isn't filling you up," she cooed softly. My blood turned to absolute ice. Giving plain water to a newborn can cause water intoxication and fatal seizures. It is a fundamental, well-known medical rule. I lunged forward, physically snatching my son aggressively out of her arms, entirely ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my core. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed, my voice echoing violently off the walls. Brenda gasped, immediately clutching her pearls in mock horror. "I raised 3 boys, Chloe. A little water never hurt anyone. You are being completely hysterical and overdramatic." She wasn't just annoying anymore. Her massive ego and outdated ignorance were a direct, physical threat to my child's safety. I realized with terrifying clarity that my baby was not safe alone with her for even a single second. I glared at her, my eyes practically burning holes into her skull. "Get out of my room," I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerously low, lethal register. She huffed, muttered something about ungrateful brats, and stomped loudly back to the desecrated nursery. I locked my door, holding my baby tight. I pulled out my phone and quickly texted Jess a single, decisive word: "Tomorrow." The time for playing nice was officially over. The absolute destruction was about to begin. Wednesday morning arrived with crystal clear, lethal precision. Mark was finally returning to the corporate office for his first full day of work since the birth. He kissed me casually on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and told me to listen to Mom. I smiled warmly, wishing him a fantastic day. 30 minutes later, Brenda emerged from the nursery wearing a ridiculous leopard print coat. She loudly announced she had a much-needed, 2-hour pampering appointment at her expensive hair salon downtown. "Try not to burn the house down while I'm gone, sweetie," she chuckled condescendingly before walking out the front door. I stood perfectly still by the front window, holding my breath, watching her heavy SUV pull out of the driveway and turn the corner. The second her car disappeared from view, the house transformed into a highly coordinated military command center. I grabbed my phone and hit speed dial. Jess was waiting. "They are clear. Execute the protocol," I said into the receiver. Less than 15 minutes later, a massive white moving truck aggressively backed into my driveway, closely followed by Jess's sleek sedan. A professional, rapid response eviction crew, 3 massive guys who looked like former linebackers, jumped out of the truck, carrying stacks of heavy cardboard boxes and industrial packing tape. Right behind them was a certified locksmith Jess had hired on a premium emergency retainer. "All right, boys, we have exactly 90 minutes to clear out the target room," Jess barked, pointing her perfectly manicured finger directly toward the stairs. "Pack everything that smells like cheap lavender and load it up." I strapped my son securely to my chest in his ergonomic carrier, feeling a massive, euphoric surge of pure adrenaline washing away my postpartum pain. I directed the locksmith to immediately begin swapping out every single exterior deadbolt on the property, upgrading them to high-security digital keypads. The trap was perfectly sprung, and the jaws were rapidly snapping shut around them. We descended upon the desecrated nursery with the ruthless efficiency of a highly trained strike team. The purge of the nursery was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of absolute destruction and reclamation. The emergency movers worked with terrifying, hyperspeed efficiency. They didn't bother folding Brenda's expensive velour tracksuits or carefully wrapping her hideous porcelain figurines. Everything was swiftly and mercilessly shoved into thick cardboard boxes, taped shut with a loud, aggressive rip, and physically carried down the stairs in rapid succession. I watched with immense, unadulterated satisfaction as her heavy, oppressive oak bed frame was dismantled and hauled out the front door, piece by heavy piece. Jess stood in the hallway, aggressively ticking items off a clipboard, ensuring absolutely nothing belonging to that woman was left behind in my home. The smell of cheap lavender began to rapidly dissipate, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of fresh cardboard and the locksmith's metal shavings. Within a blistering 45 minutes, the 10 by 10 room was completely, entirely empty. It was hollow, echoing, and finally mine again. The massive moving truck sitting in my driveway was fully loaded, packed to the brim with Brenda's entire hijacked life. I directed the movers to carefully bring my beautiful, custom-painted sage green crib back inside from the hallway. They set it up perfectly in the center of the room, exactly where it was always supposed to be. I gently placed my son's clean, fresh sheets over the mattress and hung his handmade woodland mobile back up. I stood in the doorway, tears of genuine, powerful relief finally streaming down my tired face. I had taken my sanctuary back by sheer, brute force. Downstairs, the heavy metallic click of the final high-security deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the hallway. The locksmith handed me a single master key and a sealed envelope containing the new digital access codes. I paid him handsomely in cash, locked the heavy front door, and sat on the couch with Jess to wait for the inevitable, explosive grand finale. The stage was flawlessly set, and the absolutely clueless actors were finally returning to the theater. Brenda's heavy SUV pulled aggressively into the driveway exactly at 1:15 p.m., boxing in the massive, fully loaded moving truck. Through the living room window, I watched Mark's car pull up right behind her. They both stepped out, staring in sheer, dumbfounded confusion at the massive truck parked on my property. Brenda marched confidently up the front steps, her fresh blowout bouncing, and jammed her shiny key into the front door. It didn't turn. She aggressively jiggled it, her face flushing red with sudden frustration. Mark stepped up, trying his own key. Nothing. The deadbolt was completely impenetrable. I stood up, holding my son tightly, and calmly unlocked the door from the inside, opening it just enough to block their entry. The sheer shock on their faces was absolutely priceless. "Chloe, what the hell is going on? Why is my key not working? Whose truck is that?" Mark demanded, his voice cracking with rising panic. I didn't yell. I was terrifyingly, wonderfully calm. I reached onto the console table and picked up a thick, legally binding manila folder that Jess's law firm had prepared. I shoved it hard directly into Mark's chest. "That is a formal, legally executed eviction notice for your mother," I stated coldly, looking him dead in his cowardly eyes. And attached is a postnuptial agreement. If you do not sign it, the divorce papers are right underneath it. Brenda gasped dramatically, trying to push past me. You ungrateful little brat. My things are in that room. I held my ground, raising my voice to a lethal, commanding tone. Your things are in that rented truck, Brenda. The keys are in the folder. Your lease here is permanently terminated. Mark stammered, frantically trying to backpedal. Babe, please, let's just talk about this inside. I stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust, thinking of the receipts from the delivery room. You sold my sanctuary while I was bleeding, Mark. There is absolutely nothing left to talk about here. I slammed the heavy door directly in his shocked face, locking the deadbolt with satisfying finality. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic storm of desperate phone calls and loud banging on the front door, which I entirely ignored. Mark and Brenda eventually had no choice but to drive the fully loaded rental truck away, banished from the property completely. Mark spent the next 2 weeks sleeping on his friend's terrible couch, utterly destroyed by the reality of his own catastrophic actions. When he finally realized I was absolutely serious about the divorce, he broke down and signed the brutal postnuptial agreement. It legally secured the house entirely in my name and mandated intense, non-negotiable weekly couples therapy if he wanted any chance at a relationship with his son. Brenda is permanently banned from stepping foot on my property. If she ever wants to see her grandson, it happens in a highly supervised public park on my strict terms, and if she makes a single snide comment, the visit ends immediately. Reclaiming my home was the hardest, most exhausting thing I have ever done, but it fundamentally changed me. I am no longer the quiet, agreeable girl who avoids conflict to keep the peace. I am a mother, and my primary instinct is to protect my child's physical and emotional environment at all costs. To any new mothers reading this who feel suffocated by toxic family dynamics, please trust your gut. If something feels manipulative or deeply wrong, it absolutely is. Do not ever let anyone, especially your own partner, convince you that your boundaries are unreasonable. You are the ultimate gatekeeper of your home and your baby's peace. The pure, overwhelming exhaustion of the postpartum period will make you feel incredibly weak, but deep down, you possess a terrifying, unyielding strength. Never be afraid to brutally burn a toxic bridge if it means keeping the fire away from your child. The peace I feel now, rocking my son in his beautiful, quiet nursery, is absolutely worth every single second of the war I had to wage to secure it. Sometimes the most beautiful sanctuary is the one you have to fight ruthlessly to protect.